Today, we will dive into one of the most pressing and difficult topics of our time: the demands put forward by Russia and the Ukrainian leadership in exchange for a ceasefire. This topic raises many questions, disputes, and disagreements both within countries and in the international arena. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is not just about military clashes. It is a clash of interests, ideologies, historical claims, and strategic goals. In recent months, the situation has reached a new level of tension when the parties began to put forward conditions that could change the course of events. Why is this topic so important? Because the fate of millions of people, the future of the region, and even the world order depend on the decisions that will be made now. In this video, we will try to figure out exactly what is happening, what demands Russia is making, and how the Ukrainian authorities and the international community are reacting. Why is this topic relevant today? In recent weeks, new statements have been heard in diplomatic circles and the media, which arouse concern and interest. Russia has stated its conditions, which, according to them, should become the basis for the cessation of hostilities. These demands are not just words, but a strategic move that can change the balance of power. The international community, in turn, is trying to find a balance between supporting Ukraine and finding ways to peace. Distrust of diplomacy is growing inside Ukraine, while propaganda and mobilization are intensifying inside Russia. What exactly is going on? What are Russia's demands? And how do the Ukrainian authorities react to this? What scenarios are possible? This will be discussed further. Why is it important to understand the context? Understanding the historical context helps to understand why the conflict has arisen right now and what interests the parties are pursuing. The history of relations between Russia and Ukraine is a history of complex interactions, conflicts, and attempts to find a common language. In 2014, a new phase of the conflict began, which led to the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass. These events marked a turning point, after which the situation became even more complex and multifaceted. Today, after more than a year of active hostilities, the parties are looking for new ways to achieve peace. But how realistic is it to reach an agreement? What conditions can be accepted? And what does this mean for the future of the region? To understand the current situation, it is necessary to refer to the history. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is not news, but the result of many years of processes, starting with the collapse of the Soviet Union and subsequent events. In 1991, Ukraine became an independent state, but relations with Russia remain complex and multifaceted. In 2004 and 2014, there were key events that radically changed the dynamics. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, and an armed conflict began in Donbass, which continues to this day. These events provoked international condemnation and led to sanctions against Russia. An active struggle for sovereignty and territorial integrity has begun inside Ukraine. Russia continued to consider Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence, which led to further escalation. Over the years of the conflict, the parties have worked out their positions, and international mediators have tried to find a compromise. But the conflict continues to be one of the most acute and complex in modern world politics. To date, the situation at the front remains tense. Distrust of diplomatic efforts is growing within political circles and among the population. Active hostilities have been taking place in recent months, and diplomatic initiatives often prove fruitless. Russia has announced its new demands, which, according to them, should lead to a cessation of hostilities. These demands include recognition of new borders, guarantees of non-interference, and rejection of Ukraine's accession to NATO. The Ukrainian side, in turn, declares the inadmissibility of surrender and the need to return all occupied territories. Support for a tough stance is growing within the country, while the international community is calling for dialogue and compromise. International organizations such as the UN, the EU, and the United States are actively involved in attempts to resolve the conflict, but so far without significant progress. What exactly did Russia put forward as conditions? According to recent statements, Russia demands recognition of new borders, including the annexed territories, guarantees of non-interference in the internal affairs of Russia and Ukraine, ensuring security for Russian citizens and the military, refusal of Ukraine's accession to NATO and other international organizations. Ukraine responds harshly. No concessions without the full restoration of territorial integrity. The president of Ukraine stated that any negotiations are possible only on condition of the complete withdrawal of Russian troops and the return of all occupied territories. The reaction of international partners varies. Some call for dialogue, others for increased sanctions and support for Ukraine. Opinions are divided within both countries. Some consider Russia's demands to be ultimatum, while others consider it an opportunity for negotiations. Analysts and experts are divided on the current requirements. Some believe that Russia is using these demands as a tactical move to strengthen its position and achieve concessions. Others believe that Russia is really looking for a way to consolidate its achievements and reduce international pressure. An expert on international security, Professor Ivanov, noted, "This is Russia's attempt to create new realities that will be difficult to change in the future. It is important to understand that any concessions without the full restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty could lead to further escalation." And political scientist Smirnova added, "Ukraine must remain firmly in its positions, because concessions can become a precedent for further demands and threats." Opinions are divided, and each side is looking for its own arguments to justify its actions and demands. What scenarios are possible? Here are the main ones. Continuation of the conflict. The situation remains tense. The fighting continues, and diplomacy is at an impasse. Diplomatic compromise. The parties find a common language. An agreement is reached that suits both sides. Escalation of the conflict. The situation is getting out of control. New military actions or expansion of the conflict are possible. International intervention. Intensifying the efforts of international organizations to resolve the situation. Each scenario has its own risks and opportunities, and the future depends on many factors: domestic politics, international efforts, and the will of the parties. Peace is a complex and multifaceted process. It is important to remember that every decision affects the fate of millions of people. In conflict situations, diplomacy and dialogue are the only paths to peace, but they require patience, compromise, and mutual respect. We will follow the developments and keep you informed. We hope that in the future the days will come when the conflict will be a thing of the past, and peace and tranquility will reign on earth. To understand the current situation, it is necessary to refer to the history. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is not news, but the result of many years of processes, starting with the collapse of the Soviet Union and subsequent events. The history of relations between the two countries is full of difficult moments, conflicts, diplomatic crises, and attempts to find a common language. In this part, we will analyze in detail the key stages that led to the current situation. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and 15 independent states emerged in its place. Ukraine has become one of them. This process was complex and contradictory, with many internal and external factors. Ukraine gained its independence, but immediately faced a number of challenges: economic, political, and territorial. In the first years after the collapse, the country struggled to establish sovereignty, and relations with Russia remained tense. In 1994, the Treaty of Belavezha was signed, which sealed the collapse of the USSR, and Ukraine became a nuclear power, possessing the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. However, in 1994, Ukraine renounced nuclear weapons in the framework of the Budapest Memorandum, having received security guarantees from the United States, Great Britain, and Russia. In 2004, the Orange Revolution took place, a massive protest movement against presidential election fraud. Then Viktor Yushchenko won, and a new stage of the political struggle began. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych became president, who in 2013 refused to sign an association agreement with the EU, choosing rapprochement with Russia. This caused mass protests, Euromaidan, which turned into a revolution. In February 2014, Yanukovych was overthrown, and Russia annexed Crimea. This move provoked international condemnation and marked the beginning of a new phase of the conflict. In March 2014, Russia held a referendum in Crimea, which was recognized by the international community as illegitimate. As a result, Russia annexed the peninsula, which caused a wide response. An armed struggle has begun in Donbass between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian separatists. Russia was accused of supporting the separatists, supplying weapons and military equipment. In response, the West imposed sanctions against Russia. These events marked a turning point that determined the further development of the conflict. Sentiments against Russia have intensified inside and outside Ukraine, and the international community has begun to look for ways to resolve the situation. Over the years, there have been numerous attempts at peace agreements, such as the Minsk agreements, but they have not led to a definitive solution to the conflict. Support for the Euro-Atlantic course was growing inside Ukraine, while Russia continued to consider Ukraine part of its sphere of influence. In 2018 to 2020, the situation stabilized at a certain level, but tensions remained. In 2021 to 2022, Russia began to build up a military grouping near the borders of Ukraine, which caused alarm in the world. The history of relations between Russia and Ukraine is a history of complex, sometimes contradictory processes that led to the current situation. Understanding these stages is important for understanding current requirements and development scenarios. To date, the situation at the front remains tense. Distrust of diplomatic efforts is growing within political circles and among the population. Active hostilities have been taking place in recent months, and diplomatic initiatives often prove fruitless. In this part, we will analyze in detail the current events, the main parties to the conflict, their positions and strategic goals. In 2024, the conflict reached new proportions. Fighting is taking place on the entire front, in the east, south, and in some areas of central Ukraine. Russian troops continue offensive operations, while the Ukrainian army conducts defense and counteroffensives. Important cities and strategic sites remain under the control of both sides. The war has led to enormous destruction, a humanitarian catastrophe, and millions of refugees. The Ukrainian leadership continues to insist on the full restoration of its territorial integrity. The president and parliament reject any concessions that could lead to the recognition of new borders or the autonomy of the separatist territories. Public opinion in Ukraine is divided. The majority supports a tough position, believing that concessions will lead to the loss of sovereignty. Nationalist rhetoric is intensifying inside the country, as well as support from international allies. Russia continues to insist on its demands, stating that it protects its interests and security. Propaganda, mobilization, and preparations for possible escalation are intensifying inside the country. The domestic political situation remains stable, despite sanctions and international pressure. The authorities emphasize that Russia is acting within the framework of its national interests and security. The international community continues to exert pressure on both sides. The United States, the EU, the United Kingdom, and other countries are imposing new sanctions, providing humanitarian assistance and calling for dialogue. Numerous international organizations, such as the UN, OSCE, and others, are trying to mediate, but so far there has been no progress. The current situation is a complex tangle of contradictions, interests, and strategies. The struggle for influence, security, and the future of the region continues inside and outside Ukraine. What exactly has Russia put forward as conditions for a ceasefire? What are the requirements, and how do the Ukrainian authorities and the international community respond to them? In this part, we will discuss these issues in detail. According to recent statements, Russia has put forward the following key requirements. Recognition of new borders. Russia demands recognition of the annexed territories, including Crimea and parts of Donbass, as Russian. This is one of the most controversial points, which provokes a harsh reaction from Ukraine and the international community. Guarantees of non-interference. Russia demands guarantees that Ukraine will not join NATO and other military alliances, and will not pursue policies that threaten Russia, ensuring the safety of Russian citizens. Russia requires security guarantees for its citizens and military personnel stationed on the territory of Ukraine. Refusal to join NATO. Ukraine must abandon plans to join NATO, which is one of Russia's key demands. Guarantees of economic and political neutrality. Russia demands that Ukraine remain neutral and not join international organizations that may threaten Russia's interests. Ukraine rejects these demands as impossible to fulfill. The president of Ukraine stated that any concessions are impossible without the full restoration of sovereignty and territorial integrity. The international community is divided. Some countries are calling for dialogue and compromise, while others are demanding tough sanctions and support for Ukraine. Experts' opinions on Russia's demands are also divided. Some believe that Russia is using these demands as a tactical move to strengthen its position and achieve concessions. Others believe that Russia is really pursuing strategic goals to consolidate its achievements. Russia's demands are a complex set of conditions that provoke a harsh reaction from Ukraine and the international community. The question of the possibility of their implementation remains open. Analysts and experts are divided on the current requirements. In this part, we have collected the opinions of leading experts to understand what they think about the situation. Professor Ivanov, an expert on international security, believes this is a tactical move by Russia aimed at creating new conditions for negotiations. It is important to remember that any concessions without the full restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty can lead to further escalation, adds political analyst Smirnova. Ukraine must remain firmly in its positions, otherwise it will become a precedent for further demands and threats. Opinion of international organizations. The UN and the EU call for dialogue, emphasizing the need to find a compromise that takes into account the interests of both sides. Opinions are divided, and each side is looking for its own arguments. It is important to keep in mind that the situation is very complex and multifaceted. What scenarios are possible in the near future? In this part, we will look at the main scenarios. Basic scenarios 1. Continuation of the conflict. The situation remains tense, the fighting continues, and diplomacy is at an impasse. Further escalation and expansion of the conflict is possible. Point 2. Diplomatic compromise. The parties find a common language. An agreement is reached that suits both sides. This is the most desirable scenario, but it takes time and effort. Point 3. Escalation of the conflict. The situation is getting out of control, new military actions are possible, and the conflict is expanding to other regions. Point 4. International intervention. Increased efforts by international organizations to resolve the situation, possibly with the use of peacekeeping forces. Each scenario has its own risks and opportunities. An important factor is the will of the parties and international pressure. Conflict is not just about politics and diplomacy. These are the fates of millions of people affected by the war. In this section, we will tell the stories of those who survived these events. Real stories. Maria from Donetsk. She lost her home and had to seek refuge. Her story is a story of ruined destinies and hopes for a better future. Alexei, a military man, participated in battles, suffered psychological trauma, and is now fighting for his life and health. Volunteers and humanitarian workers help victims, risking their lives. These stories help us understand that conflict is not just about numbers and political statements, but about real destinies, ruined lives, and hopes for the future. The stories of the participants show that there are real people behind the political demands, their sufferings and hopes. The international community is actively responding to what is happening. In this part, we will talk about the actions of the United States, the EU, the UN, and other organizations. The reaction of international players. The United States imposes new sanctions, provides humanitarian assistance, calls for dialogue. EU. They support Ukraine, strengthen sanctions, and offer mediation. UN. Calls for a ceasefire, humanitarian aid and dialogue. Turkey, Sweden, Poland. Mediate and negotiate. International efforts are an important instrument of pressure and compromise. The international response is a set of measures aimed at stabilizing the situation and finding a peaceful solution. Peace is a complex and multifaceted process. In this part, we will summarize the results and talk about the hopes for the future. Conflict is not only politics, but also the fate of millions of people. Diplomacy, dialogue, and compromise are important. The international community must play an active role. Time is a key factor, and a lot depends on it. We hope that in the future the days will come when the conflict will be a thing of the past, and peace and tranquility will reign on earth. Only through joint efforts can the stability and prosperity of the region be achieved. This was our full review of the situation, requirements, and scenarios for the development of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We hope that this information will help you better understand what is happening and draw your own conclusions. Thanks for attention. Follow our releases, and may peace and tranquility return to these lands.